Okay, everyone, this is the fifth and last part of the lecture on Arendt and Arendt's analysis of human rights, her critique of human rights, and her account of totalitarianism. Um, and we left off essentially with her critique of the idea of universal human rights, focusing on the situation of the stateless. And I argued that this led to her um, alternative account of rights as being fundamentally political in character rather than being based on human development in any sense. And now we want to shift to actually to her discussion of totalitarianism, which is this is the book from which the chapters that you have actually come from, the origins of totalitarianism. And so one way to make the shift would be to think about um, this discussion that she provides of the situation of the stateless, of refugees, of people that we obviously are experiencing around us. We're in the midst of refugee crises, which, as she says, these crises have really not stopped since the end of the First World War. The world has been living with these kinds of refugee crises, adding more and more numbers to the people who lose government protection, really since the end of the First World War. Europe has been in the midst of a Syrian refugee crisis, which is ongoing. Um, and so the question is there some connection actually between what she says about the refugees and the stateless, and the way that she talks about their situation to criticize the idea of universal human rights, and what she says about totalitarianism? And I want to start out by saying that there's a very direct link between what she has to say about stateless, the refugees, and what she says about totalitarianism. Um, in fact, in a way, uh, this is the way in which you can think about our own situation, and what makes it actually relevant from the perspective of some discussion of totalitarianism. Because we could very easily say, oh, totalitarianism, these horrible communist dictatorships and Nazism and genocide, what does this really have to do with us? As bad as anybody might paint the contemporary world, we're certainly not there in any sense. Um, so, is there a link, and what would the link be? I think Arendt's argument is what defines above all the situation of the refugees and of the stateless. Uh, well, they have been pushed outside of all community. They've been pushed outside of all belonging. They essentially have been left with no identity. They've been reduced simply to their humanity, to their human nakedness, essentially, right? And that means that they are essentially treated as a mass of people, um, ruled essentially by the police powers within the states that they find themselves in, since they are outside of the law, since they're not citizens and the law doesn't apply to them, right? So, what is the link to totalitarianism? There's a point where she says the more refugees you have, and you can extend this to say the more uprooted people you have, the more people you have who are in danger of losing their identity, of having no place or a sense of belonging in society, the more people like that you have, the more there is the chance of moving towards a police state in which the police will basically rule people as a mass outside of the law. Um, and this is the sense in which Arendt says, look, we have to be very, very careful when we start, instead of talking about, well, our human development over time will make sure that everybody will end up with the same universal rights. Her argument is no, we have to always be incredibly careful, about getting groups of people in our society who are completely marginalized, who do not belong, um, who are not integrated. The stateless are the perfect example of that. And yes, our usual approach to this is to say, well, isn't it unfortunate that we have these people in our society? Hopefully, we'll come up with an international solution. Hopefully, our overall development will actually deal with the situation of these people. But what Arendt is saying, it's actually the opposite. The more people like this you have in your society, the more likely it is that ultimately everybody will become to be treated like one of these people, right? One of these people who don't have any belonging, identity, who are treated as part of a mass and molded like a mass. That is what totalitarianism actually ultimately is. Totalitarianism is a form of government that treats everybody as if they were like stateless refugees. People who are molded as a mass to whom anything could happen at any moment, regardless of what it is that they do, regardless of what it is that they think, it's irrelevant. So think of the situation of the refugees and universalize that to everybody in society. That's basically totalitarianism. Um, and we'll talk more about that essentially in this part of the lecture, which um, I want you guys to, if you listen to this lecture, hopefully you'll also have a chance to listen to it again for next week, because it's essentially covering the material also for survival in Auschwitz and the Holocaust. This is essentially the historical background that we need also for that text. Um, so I hope this connection that she's basically saying, look, whenever we get what does she say about after the First World War, hatred became a basic um, aspect of relationships between people in society and between different peoples, right? Uh, all societies came to be defined in us versus them terms. Uh, this is the great moment of danger. And when many people look around our world today and say, look at how many societies are increasingly becoming so polarized, where there's increasing hatred, where there's increasing sense of some people who belong and others who don't, and then people who want to exclude others or who feel excluded themselves. For Arendt, this is the breeding ground actually for totalitarianism. And that's why her focus was fundamentally on not what we share as human beings, but how do we actually create community? How do we create belonging? How do we prevent this uh, this tendency to move towards a polarized definition of who belongs and who doesn't, so that we get masses of people who are pushed out of one society, then they go to another society, then they cause polarization in that society, and this is the way in which, for her, totalitarianism actually starts. Okay, um, I hope you can see this connection, and it'll become hopefully stronger through this lecture as we deal with the second chapter uh, when she writes about totalitarianism as a new form of government, a government based on terror and ideology. Um, so, part of this discussion we had already started on in the last part of the lecture when we talked about the rise of the ideological state, from the nation state to the ideological state. Um, Remember, uh, a big part of um, the last two videos basically were about how the nation state and how national identity changes over the course of the 19th century. The nation state, increasingly, instead of thinking of itself as founded on universal human rights, of all peoples having the right to rule themselves, increasingly becomes imperial, focused simply on maintaining its own power and sovereignty in the midst of global competition, which means essentially imperial conquest and expansion on the part of the industrialized European states who are in a position to do that. And then it means essentially, in a way, um, becoming subject to the power of imperial states if you don't have the capacity to engage in this kind of imperial expansion. So we talked about how the nation state went from this ideal of each people comes to have the freedom to fundamentally rule itself on the basis of rights that we all share as human beings, to a nationality coming to be seen as a scene of rivalry, of struggle, almost a kind of Darwinian struggle for existence, which leads to the imperial nation state and then ends in a what for Arendt comes to be the ideological state, right? The state focused fundamentally on defining people through their ideologies, and whether they can or cannot belong, not on the basis of citizenship and common human rights, but on the basis of ideological considerations. And the ideological state, in a way, has already come into being in the aftermath of the First World War, when we have the Soviet Union, the first communist state, vying against, struggling against still liberal capitalist nation states. And then there's the rise of a new ideology, fascism, right? So this imperialist nationalist rivalry that leads into the First World War, after the First World War, ends in the rise of ideological states and ideological struggle. And we're going to talk about these ideologies and the ideological struggle that they represented, especially about fascism, since we haven't actually talked about the rise of, we haven't talked about fascism as an ideology. We've talked about liberal capitalism and thinking through the ideas of Kant and Adam Smith and Rousseau, and we talked about Marx and communism, and we talked a little bit about how during the class time, how Lenin and the Bolsheviks um, essentially revised Marxist thinking to create the idea of a communist one party state um, that would essentially industrialize through a command economy from above rather than using capitalist investment from European countries. And so created a new model of how do we industrialize, how do we create growth. So we've talked about these two ideologies, these two forms, you could say, of the ideological state. And when Arendt talks about the decline of the nation state and the rise of the ideological state, that's what she means. It means that really all of the 20th century was focused on a struggle between grand ideologies. So, yes, we ended up with the United Nations after the Second World War, and there was a League of Nations after the First World War. But the reality is that all of the new nation states that were created were all bound up actually in the midst of this ideological struggle for most of the 20th century, especially between capitalism and communism. That continues obviously after the Second World War until the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when she says that belonging and identity increasingly came to be defined in ideological terms, and that there was a shift from trying to integrate people on the basis of citizenship, which had been the origin of the nation state, to excluding people on the basis of ideological belonging, that's true. She sees that as being true for all these forms of states. Even the liberal capitalist countries, even the democratic countries in Europe after the First World War, all passed denationalization laws. All passed laws allowing them to get rid of people, to take citizenship away from people, um, if they didn't actually follow the ideology or sense of order of the state in which they were. Um, to this day, I can give you a personal example. I'm a naturalized American citizen, and when I took the citizenship test and provided information to become an American citizen, one of the questions is, are you or have you ever been a communist? Right? That is basically saying American belonging and citizenship is defined against the communist ideology, right? So all states moved towards this ideological definition of belonging. And the three great ideologies that were struggling with each other in the aftermath of the First World War were liberal capitalism, um, the progressive capitalist democratic societies that we've talked about and that are still, for most people, at the heart of where the world still is and what our ideals should be. But uh, now, after the First World War, with the rise of the Soviet Union, a completely new ideology and vision of what progress and what freedom actually should mean in the world, a completely different vision of where the world ultimately would be headed, and then a new ideology, fascism, and then Nazism. So let's talk a little bit, since we've talked a good bit about the other two ideologies, let's talk a little bit about fascism. Where do fascism and Nazism come from? Um, the first part of what become fascist and then eventually Nazi ideology um, is right wing nationalism. When I say right wing nationalism, this almost sounds like a truism in the sense that most people think of nationalism as inherently somehow being right wing. Think about it for yourself. When I say the word nationalism, most people will think of right wing parties of one kind or another, right? Um, but if we go back to the French Revolution, you know that nationalism starts out very much on the left. Nationalism, in the work of Rousseau and in the work of Sieyès, uh, is about fighting the aristocracy, right? Uh, it's about citizenship. It's about the rule of the people. It's about democracy. It's about patriotism. So, nationalism as an ideology actually starts out very much on the left side of the spectrum. And then through the course of the 19th century, it increasingly moves to the right. And everything that we've talked about how national identity actually changes over the course of the 19th century, should help you understand what this shift actually meant, right? Um, a shift to seeing nationality increasingly about uh, the struggle and survival of your nation in the international context, for example, um, increasingly seeing the nation as besieged by two forces, by um, a global capital movement of labor everywhere. Everything being about money, and so that taking away people's ethnic and racial homogeneity and identity, right? On the other hand, uh, the workers coming to identify not with people in their own country, but with people elsewhere, right? These are the two dangers that leads to this much more ethnic and exclusive and racialized vision of nationalism as protecting itself from these international forces. The international forces, both of capital and individuals just seeking profit on the one hand, um, and of an international identity of workers on the other hand, right? So by the end of the 19th century, there is this already with the imperial nation state in international relations, but internally with nationalist movements that are focused on defining the nation in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, and in an exclusive way to protect it from all of these international forces besieging the nation and its power, and arguing for its expansion and its growing power for it to be able to defend itself in this struggle between all nations. This is something we've already talked about to some extent, right? We talked about it mostly as a kind of strategy of nation states to maintain themselves in the context of global competition, but we also talked about it as how this becomes a fundamentally different way of thinking about what national identity is, right? That it's fundamentally about um, protecting the specific people and race of the nation against these kinds of international forces, allowing it to compete and survive in the struggle with other nations. So, right wing nationalism is certainly already there by the First World War, and it's one of the reasons for why the First World War happens in the first place. And then the experience of the war itself um, becomes kind of the powder keg, the explosive for this right wing nationalism to turn into a full fledged new ideology called fascism and then eventually Nazism. So, how to understand what happens in the First World War? Well, the First World War really was a cataclysmic event in the history of Europe. And I haven't had enough time to be able to go through and to talk about this in more detail. But if you imagine this world in which everybody thought, oh, we're making great progress, we're moving towards some kind of a perfect society. And then suddenly you have this absolutely horrendous war, which kills off a whole generation of young men across Europe. All of that great technological progress that had been made and that had been seen as the way in which progress and prosperity were going to be inevitable. Well, now all of that technological progress is used actually for people to massacre and destroy each other. And the power of the nation state, remember, had been that it could ask all of the people to actually fight on its behalf. Um, well, what if you use that power now, not only as the French revolutionaries did against aristocratic armies? What if you use that power? What if whole peoples actually started to fight each other, right? Uh, this is the sense in which really the reason why modern warfare, um, war was something glorious for almost all of human history. We started out with Arjuna in the Gita, right, doing his duty as a warrior, and the glory that comes to the warrior. Um, and really, war and conquest throughout human history until the 20th century were essentially seen as glorious undertakings. They were associated with the elite, the power of the elite, the privileges of the elite. Most people in our world uh, don't have that perspective on war today. And the people who do, we tend to be afraid of as being somehow fascists in one way or another. And that's not a wrong way of thinking, because the First World War was this horrendous experience which really made people rethink the idea of, are we really making progress? This modern world that's supposed to be creating the perfect society, is that really happening if this is the result of it? This absolute massacre of a generation of young men. Um, and not only that, all of these plans, if whole peoples are fighting each other, then the only way to survive and to win the war is to break the will of another people. How do you do that? To break the will of another people uh, takes on genocidal tones. So there were all of these plans, for example, on the part of belligerents on both sides of the war to try to starve out the other population, to break their will to fight. The First World War was not did not end up being actually genocidal in the way that the Second World War ends up being genocidal. Most of the people who died in the war were actually soldiers and young men. But it created this sense in which, in modern warfare, since you have whole peoples fighting each other, you have to break the will of the other side to fight, which means not just beating people on the battlefield, but actually, in a way, breaking another society, breaking another people, which again has genocidal overtones to it. This is why war increasingly came to be seen not as something glorious and heroic, but as an absolute disaster, essentially, for everybody in the society, except for certain groups of people, soldiers, groups of soldiers from the war who had found the war experience not to be this horrendous disaster, but who had actually found it to be exhilarating, who had found themselves as letting go of their self, of their instinct for survival, to fight for something bigger, usually at least their core, the people that they were fighting for. And in this moment of basically letting go of their self and their sense of survival, basically finding themselves new as new people, right? Who became hardened and who had a sense that this is what life fundamentally is. Um, I live for my group. I sacrifice myself for the group, and there's an exhilaration in that. We're all part of it essentially together, and those groups of soldiers, when they came back home and they saw now all of the squabbling after the war, with um, uh, all of the workers, for example, who had been promised all kinds of things to go along with the war, they were disgusted by the societies that they came back into. Um, and they took over right wing nationalism, uh, its ethos, this idea of the nation and the story of the nation as uh, being more important than the story of any of the individuals within it, and the nation as being involved in a struggle, essentially, and in a competition with other nations and other peoples, right? Uh, they took over this idea and they remade it in the image of an endless war. This is where fascism essentially comes from. It takes the ideas of right-wing nationalism and it turns them into an ideology of endless war. That's why uh, when we see somebody thinking that war is a great thing today, we see them as somehow being fascists in one way or another. And in that way, we're not actually wrong, because fascists are some of the only people left who exult in warfare, essentially, as an ideology, as a way of life. Because the argument is, um, the story only of the race or only of the nation matters. All other stories, all other individual stories are simply subservient to it. And uh, the question for the nation and for its glory and for its survival is obviously to be able to struggle. Struggle means war, right? So you see how right wing nationalism and the sense of warfare as a cleansing experience of letting go of the self and becoming part of something bigger, these two things go hand in hand and create a new ideology, right? The ideology of creating the master nation, of creating the master race through a war that is essentially endless. We can talk about this more in the context of our classroom discussion, but I hope this gives you some sense of fascism. And fascism is especially focused on this total story of the nation and of the state. And Nazism is particularly focused on the story being the story of the race. One is focused especially on the state. The other one and the struggle and the competition of the state for greatness, and the other one is focused especially on the story of the race. The way that we can tell that essentially uh, the era before the Second World War is an era of ideological struggle, um, is that all of these ideologies, in an interesting way, lumped the other two together and said, we are the only real alternative because the other two ideologies are actually the same thing. And um, for us, looking back, often we look at fascism and we see it as, oh, well, there was fascist Italy, and Italy becomes fascist under Mussolini in 1922. And then the Nazis take over in Germany in 1933. So we tend to think of it as a somewhat exceptional experience. But actually, fascism was very, very widespread all around the world, including in Europe. And there was a kind of continuum from authoritarian governments to fascist governments. And there were many more. There were essentially around 17 of the 27 states in Europe, the eve of the Second World War, would have to be considered on this continuum from authoritarianism to fascism. Obviously, Franco Spain would have to be, and the Franco dictatorship would have to be placed somewhere within that continuum, tending towards fascism. And like I'm telling you, uh, there were in a way more of them than liberal democratic states in Europe at the start of World War One, and that had a lot to do with the Great Depression. Fascism is born before the Great Depression, but it's really as a result of the Great Depression in 1929, which starts in the United States um, in ways that uh, we could easily, in a way, forecast having read Marx. Right? This was the greatest crisis that capitalism up until now has actually undergone, and it came from the fact that um, the economy was so over leveraged. Um, People basically bought so much on credit. You have, again, as Marx says, uh, an economy based on mass production, which requires mass consumption. Well, if workers don't have the wages to actually consume, then how are they going to? Well, one way is to loan them money, give them credit actually to consume. But that clearly sets up the possibility of economic crisis once people have a sense that that credit actually can't be paid back, right? And that's how we get the Great Depression in the United States. And the United States in the First World War actually had become the great creditor. They had loaned money to all of the European states actually to fight the war. And um, once the European states and Americans basically, in a way, were through those loans. In a way, keeping Europe afloat after the First World War, and when their own economy goes into depression, and when the Europeans stop paying their loans, they basically let go of Europe. And that leads to absolute economic disaster all around Europe. And that is the experience that, in a way, makes possible the rise of fascism in the Nazi version of it in Germany when Hitler and the Nazis come to power in 1933. So after 1933, if we go from 1933 to 1939, you see now increasingly more and more authoritarian or fascist states rising up, more and more struggle, especially between communists and fascists. Why? Because many people looked at 1929 and the Great Depression and they thought, uh, capitalism is dead. For us, this seems hard to believe because we live with liberal capitalism as the norm. Um, it's hard for us to imagine that there might have been a moment in which people really thought, okay, liberal capitalism has actually died. And that's what the Great Depression did, with astronomical rates of unemployment, over 40%, for example, in Germany before the Nazis come to power. Um, People thought this is the end. Everything that Marx, for example, had said, it's happening. Capitalism is collapsing. So then the only question is, okay, what's the future going to be like? Is it going to be communist or is it going to be fascist? So actually, the liberals, in a way, were very much on the defensive in the 1930s, and the fundamental ideological struggles seemed to be between the fascists on the one hand and the communists on the other. Um, but all of these ideologies actually, in a way, lumped the other two together. And this is the way in which you could see that this was the 1930s, really was a scene of ideological struggle in this sense. Liberals, this word that Hannah Arendt uses, totalitarianism, this is used first by liberals to talk about how communists and fascists are actually fundamentally the same. Even though it may seem that their ideologies are going in such different directions, actually, both of them, at the end of the day, are totalitarian. Meaning what? Meaning that for both of them, actually, the story of individuals, the private lives of people, the preferences of individuals, remember, which is the basis of Adam Smith's talk about capitalism and why capitalism is productive. It leads people to follow their own interests, to follow their own preferences. Well, liberals say this is what both communists and fascists fundamentally destroy. They destroy the private lives of people. They say that the stories of individuals are meaningless. That means that anything could happen to any individual in the name of the collective in communism and in fascism. And that's why fundamentally both of them, even despite all of their differences, look the same. Uh, they're both totalitarian. Fascists argued that actually it's liberalism and communism that at the end of the day are fundamentally the same. Why? Because they said both of these ideologies are really focused on happiness. They're focused on prosperity. And so they're focused fundamentally on the prosperity of individuals in society. Marx would agree with that. That's why he says it's in communism that people actually ultimately become individuals and do and become who they want to be, do what it is that they actually want to do rather than simply doing things because that's the only way to make money, right? Um, so fascists argue at the end of the day, despite all of their differences about how the happiness of the individual can be ascertained, how the happiness of the individual actually can be brought about. They're both focused on that. Whereas we fascists understand that life is not about happiness. Life is about the glorious story of the state, the glorious story of the race that every individual is fundamentally a part of. And anybody's life only has meaning to the extent that they're part of that story. Their happiness is irrelevant. It's to the extent that they serve in the struggle of this nation, in the struggle of the race. That's the only sense in which any individual life actually has meaning. And we fascists are the ones who actually realize that. Communists argued that uh, liberals and fascists are actually fundamentally the same, because they said actually fascism is the end of liberalism, right? In a world of that kind of imperial competition, including economic competition that we were talking about, they made the argument that what fascists do, basically, this is the bourgeoisie that uh, to protect private property, basically takes over the state, um, creates monopoly enterprises, um, essentially puts the whole economy and society on a war footing, right? To go, it directs the economy altogether. Why? Because through exploiting, through war, essentially other societies, it can then guarantee private property by buying off the workers within the state, right? So communists said uh, every liberal democratic state will ultimately become fascist, because this is the only way capitalism can actually survive. Um, it can only protect private property ultimately through war and through monopoly as a way of bribing workers. So you can see how all of each of these ideologies lumps the other two together. And this is the sense in which we're living in the 1930s, in this era of ideological struggle. And uh, when Hannah Arendt writes about totalitarianism, she's in a way addressing this scene of ideological struggle that has already played itself out in leading to the Second World War, right? The Nazi Germany is not appeased in any sense. So even though essentially Czechoslovakia, first, a part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, is given over to Hitler in 1938. He essentially takes a larger part of it and creates a kind of puppet Slovak state already in March 1939. But it's not done. He's not willing to let go. He goes and invades Poland. Um, that leads to the First World War. And then in 1941, even though he had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, since he really saw the Soviet Union as the real ideological foe of the Nazi Party, he attacks the Soviet Union, and this is how we end up with the Soviet Union and the liberal capitalist world actually coming together to fight fascism and Nazism in the Second World War. The Second World War has come to an end, and Hannah Arendt is basically now talking about this world of ideological struggle that she herself has lived through, and that is in a way ongoing, right, after the Second World War. Even with the defeat of Nazism, there's still the struggle between liberal democratic capitalism and communism on the other side. And this is like she writes about totalitarianism, and she says this actually, the way that it's usually talked about as a convenient way of putting together um, communists and fascists, or basically as a kind of a dirty word, right? Which is how we use fascism. Anybody that we disagree with, especially on the right, people call them fascists, right? And it's it's very easy for people to do this. But Arendt wants to argue that actually totalitarianism, this is a new form of government, and that it has very, very deep roots in the modern experience. In everything that we've actually talked about in talking about the modern world, right? She wants to talk about how totalitarianism is actually a new modern form of government, and that it's not simply the same thing as tyranny, or as it's not the same thing as authoritarianism, right? And the way she talks about that is by talking about the role of the law in totalitarianism. Uh, Tyranny is a form of lawless government. Um, and obviously, totalitarianism doesn't function according to positive law. It doesn't function according to law in the sense, in the rule of law, for example, that we see both in Kant or in Rousseau. Laws that hold everybody accountable and apply ultimately to everybody in society. Certainly, that's not the case in a society in which the party can decide at any moment what happens to anybody, regardless of what it is that they have done or have thought, uh, if it's convenient. So, for example, um, so many of the people who had been with Hitler and had been part of his coming to power were liquidated after he came to power because he saw it as being convenient, because he had been very closer to working class movements became before he came to power. After he came to power, he saw those people as scaring middle class people, so he decided these are the brown shirts, the storm troopers, right? He basically decides to downgrade them. He assassinates the leader of that group of people, right? That's how totalitarianism works. It's certainly not functioning according to any laws that would apply universally to everybody. But is it simply lawless, like tyranny and like authoritarianism? This is where Arendt disagrees. Um, and this is where she says actually totalitarianism uh, has, as I'm saying, very deep roots in the modern world because it does follow a law. Yes, it's not those universal laws that would hold everybody accountable, but it's not lawless. Its law is actually the law of history. That's what it claims to be executing. That's what totalitarian governments claim to be doing, right? And what are those laws of history? They are essentially those laws of progress that we have been talking about up to now, but now defined in such a way, the law of progress being the progress of the master race, the Aryan race. So it's still about perfection, right? But now, clearly, it's not applied in any sense of a universal, this is going to make everybody happy. But actually, the perfection means that we have to get rid of all of those people who would be an obstacle to the self realization of the master race, of the Aryan race. In the case of communism, well, yes, it's defined supposedly universally to be everybody's going to be a worker, and so it's going to serve the workers. But if the people who have property now are enemies of the workers, then creating the perfect state, creating the perfect society, since communism ultimately, as at least ideologically, will even go beyond the state, means destroying essentially the people of property, or anybody who stands in the way of creating the perfect society. So uh, Arendt argues the fundamental instrument of totalitarianism is not like in a lawless society. In a lawful society, the laws are used to try to discipline and stabilize the actions of people. You let them, through their own freedom, essentially uh, discipline themselves through the law. In tyranny, it's fear, right? There are no laws, but you make people afraid if they somehow go against the interest of the authoritarian or tyrannical leader, right? Uh, Arendt says in totalitarianism, even fear, it's not fear, right? Because again, it's irrelevant. It's not that people can save themselves if they're afraid and they do what is necessary to survive or keep themselves alive. If they're defined, if people are defined as being uh, obstacles to the progress of the master race, to the perfection of humanity, um, to the progress of the working class and the creation of the perfect society, it doesn't matter what they think or what they do. They are essentially defined against history and where history is going, and so they can be liquidated. Um, this is the sense in which totalitarianism is founded fundamentally on terror, because terror is the way in which the laws of history, which, according to this interpretation of history, are going to realize themselves anyway, but through terror, by taking people and shaping them as a mass, we basically accelerate the movement of history towards its goal. So, if the whole idea of progress is to create the perfect human beings, create the perfect race, then, well, handicapped people, um, these are biologically inferior people, as the Nazis, for example, see them. In fact, what they call handicapped people is life unworthy of life. So, that life should be liquidated. Those people should not be allowed to continue living or propagating and bringing more people like themselves, right? Uh, in fact, the genocide of the Jews first starts out by the programs that the Nazis innovate um, to liquidate and get rid of handicapped people in societies, in their own societies, right? You see, uh, uh, here there's no, if you're defined as being against the movement of history towards its goal, it doesn't matter who you are. Today you could be on our side, but tomorrow you can be liquidated, right? And this is the sense in which terror basically turns everybody in society into a mass that can be molded and shaped according to presumably what the laws of history are supposed to be. And how are those laws defined? Well, that's the whole point of ideology, right? This is what ideology does. It defines this logical movement of history. Um, if the perfection is about creating the perfect race, then the ideology will define everything that happens throughout all of history as fundamentally moving towards in this direction, so that no other historical experience could potentially get in the way of, well, this is where things are going, and so we're just doing what is meant to happen, uh, and we are being logical. um, we actually have the courage to go where history is bound to go. Um, this is why Hannah Arendt talks about totalitarianism as a new form of government based fundamentally on terror and ideology, right? Because ideology defines the laws of history, the laws of movement, against whose logic there's nothing anybody can do, and terror executes them. And Arendt says this kind of government has never existed in human history until now. And she says there is a basic human experience that must be at the heart of this new kind of government. And what is it? And she argues that it's actually human loneliness. This is actually what has been made possible also by the modern world. Before, in the pre modern world, yes, people did not have so much freedom in any sense to determine their own fate. They found themselves within groups that, in a way, defined them before they had any chance to think about who they would want or what not want not to be. Um, but that also meant that people didn't really experience a great deal of loneliness until the modern world. It's in the modern world where people come to be individualized, right? They are taken out of these groups, and it said it's on to you to decide in the marketplace, for example, who you're going to be. So people are pushed out of all kinds of social, customary experiences, and they increasingly do find themselves alone, having to essentially create a sense of themselves, create an identity for themselves. But this also creates the possibility of loneliness. And it's the experience of loneliness. The more actually people are incapable of finding that identity, the more they are treated and are seen as part of a mass. That is the experience that actually makes ultimately totalitarianism and totalitarian rule ultimately possible. That's what makes it possible to treat everybody um, as if their opinions and their actions essentially are meaningless and irrelevant, because that's exactly how lonely people actually feel. And we live in societies that has actually made this possible as a kind of experience which had not been possible in the past. Okay, I'll stop there, and we can discuss these in the everything I've talked about Arendt in the classroom. And this lecture can also be used when we talk about survival in Auschwitz.